Right. In the interest of keeping this on time and the fact that admittedly nobody has to hear my introductions, I'm going to go ahead and get started this morning. Um, I'm sure many of you want to be outside or ready to be outside. So welcome actually to the final workshop in our 4-part series of webinars on how to plan and build an accessory dwelling unit. We're so pleased that we've had so many of you following along and attending multiple workshops in the series, and quite a few people actually also watching the recordings from the OPOP website. I'm Janae Huber, and I'm the co-founder of Olympians for People-Oriented Places, or OPOP. OPOP is a group of volunteers whose vision is a compact and diverse Olympia designed around people-oriented places. OPOP volunteer Virginia Sorrells had the idea for this event series and organized it with help from Nick Roman, myself, and Phil Vandevanter. Given that this is our last event, I just want to pause for a moment and add some extra thanks to our volunteers. Virginia has really done all of the heavy lifting to create a series that gets to the heart of what we hope that you need to know to move an ADU project forward. And she's kept this workshop alive for a year. We had attempted it as an in-person event last March and canceled due to coronavirus. So it's been wonderful to see its different vision as a series of Zoom events. And Nick and Phil have been extraordinarily helpful on the day ofs. It's taken a load of stress off Virginia and myself to know that they're in the wings helping to shepherd each event forward. We're also so grateful to our local sponsors who helped us pay for the Zoom account and the expanded Zoom account when the registrations were stronger than expected. The South Sound section of the Washington chapter of the American Planning Association, also known as our local planners, stepped in to support this series right out of the gate. And in addition to presenting at Workshop 2 on ADU financing, local bank OliFed helped us to expand our Zoom account when that first event went over the attendance limit. So we're so grateful for their collaboration and the work that both of those groups do in our region. Today, we're going to be covering construction. If you missed any of the previous workshops, they were all recorded. As I mentioned in the beginning, they covered rules and regulations, financing, and planning and design. And finally, a couple of items of business today before I introduce our speakers. We're going to ask that you use the Q&A tool on your toolbar for questions, and we'll go through as many as possible after the presentations. Our workshop today has more than 100 attendees, and to ensure the maximum benefit, we also request that you keep your questions as general as possible. We'd also love to know how you heard about this event. It's helpful for us because promoting these events always feels a little bit like you're rolling the dice. So we're going to go ahead and launch a poll. And Phil, if you would do that, I don't have access to all of the toolbar in the view that I'm in right now. We'll launch a poll. It'll come up on your screen and you can tell us how you've heard about the event. At least I think we will. Uh-oh.
Janae, I think we're going to have to do it the old-fashioned way.
Oh.
I'm not seeing it, so.
Okay. We'll leave it. I'm going to trust that the info we gathered at the other events will hold true for this one as well. And finally, as I mentioned before, this session is being recorded, but we will also post it on the OPOP website. Usually takes us somewhere around a week to get it posted. There are also some really fantastic links on the OPOP website that will just give you more information, some tools that different panelists have mentioned, et cetera. So take a look at the OPOP website if you want to go back and hear something again or see any of the tools that were discussed. And now I'd like to welcome our two panelists. Today, we're going to have the chance to hear from Pete Chramiec. Pete is the owner of Bicycle Homebuilding, where he employs climate-specific strategies to build high-performing and durable structures that need little maintenance over the course of their lifetimes. He's been doing work in Olympia for 16 years. I first got to know Pete when he did a build out on my family's business. He and his team did an unbelievably beautiful job. And honestly, when you think the world of a contractor after a project, I think that's really saying something about their integrity and communication skills. And finally, I would be remiss if I didn't include just a couple of gems from the bio that Pete's daughters wrote for his website. Sorry, Pete.
No.
This was inevitable. Some of his skills include eating cookies, all the cookies, losing at cribbage, and building houses, maybe. And along with Pete today, we have Off-White. Like Pete, I had the good fortune of working with Off as both a part-time art installer, actually, and for his talented wife, and as a general contractor. I am sitting in the basement that Off remodeled for me. He came to this work in 1980 when he moved into the first dumpy house that he bought. I think we're all familiar with some Olympia dumpy houses. His pal and mentor, Lloyd Johnson, knocked down a pointless closet in the kitchen, and Off realized that houses are malleable things, which can be made better through time and effort. Over the decades since, despite building several new homes, he has persisted with remodel construction, striving to create a better fit between people and their homes, seeking elegant solutions to the mutant situations existing houses inevitably present. Again, I can imagine many of us are familiar with that. So thank you, Off and Pete, for being here today.
Today, you're going to hear about general issues you might confront when building new or converting an existing space. And some of the projects discussed may include non-ADUs that illustrate the topics at hand. So these are sort of generalizable cues that may include non-ADUs. Next slide, Janae. What we're not going to cover today are specific permitting or legal issues which vary according to location and type of project. So you should contact your local municipality or look at our first video, ADU 101 Rules and Regulations, which was recorded on February 27th. I'd also like to say a word about your questions and answers. Try to keep them as general as possible. So don't make them project specific, but if you've got something to ask that will benefit the entire audience, that would be nice to hear. So please try to keep your questions as broad as possible. Thank you so much. And now I'll turn it over to Pete. Thank you.
Yeah.
Next slide.
Thanks, Virginia. So first thing, I'm going to encourage all of you that haven't seen the other three to go back and watch the videos. They're hugely informative, really quickly. The last one about planning ties into this first question. So what do builders and remodelers do that architects don't? And if you watched the previous one about planning, Jason from Artisans Group, and I believe the other guy's name is Matt, did a really thorough and quick job of what they do. I work with Artisans Group a lot, and it's, as a builder, it's so wonderful that they've already tracked down every setback issue, every siting issue. They also will run the permit through the city. So I literally just get to pick up the permit and take over at that point. And so a really good architect designer will kind of check off all the boxes. And when I pick up that permit, I can start building that day, and often do. I'm usually kind of waiting for a permit, and I kind of love just starting to dig on the day I get the permit. And then from that point on, my company and Offs are similar. We have our own carpenters. So we'll do all the carpentry, siding, finish work, kind of all the extra insulation details that we do for energy efficiency purposes. So we're on site the whole time. And then concurrently, I'm also running all the subcontractors, dealing with all the materials, paying everybody, wrestling with the subcontractors to keep the costs to what they said they are, and then paying everybody, which is surprisingly a gigantic pain in the butt. I'm just constantly writing checks to everyone in Olympia. And then we graciously finish the job and hand over the key, and that's pretty much it.
But also a budget. We often provide the cost of the project.
Yes, we do.
Yes.
Yes, we do. We meticulously put a budget together and stick to it exactly every time with no problems. Sometimes there's problems, but then we work those out with the clients.
Okay, so when should I contact a builder or remodeler before starting the permitting process? My favorite way is to be involved during the design process, but that entails you as the homeowner first kind of interviewing and deciding who you want to work with as a builder. Because in a lot of times with other designers, artisans is pretty darn turnkey, but other folks, it can be very useful to have some input to the design process, to collaborate with the designer or architect. So, you know, that's in a perfect world. A lot of times you might be wanting to get multiple competing quotes, and then you really need to have the complete design and often a set of specifications, because just because you have a plan, it doesn't really mean that any one builder is going to build the same thing out of that. There's a surprising amount of variation depending on a builder's approach to things. So you can do that afterwards, but you miss that timing bit, like when Pete gets the permit that the architect has purchased, everything rolls right along. Whereas if you get a completed design and you approach builders, it may be 6 months before you actually break ground.
How do designs get transformed into plans? Yeah, we same thing as I really described before. All the budgeting and all the specifications have been checked off, and then we jump right in. The excavation shows up, the materials show up, the carpenters get busy. I guess the hidden part is all the discussions that go into the plans between the clients and the builder, which is kind of the specifications that Off just mentioned. You know, what kind of tile, what kind of sink, which doorknob, the whole list. You can get really detailed about that, or you can just kind of have a budget. Often I'll show folks just, you know, a previous house that I did, and that's good enough. They're like, yeah, just do that. That's great. And then I'll already have a kind of library of costs and can estimate that pretty quickly. Some clients, you know, are really picky and really, you know, want to pick every light bulb and everything. And that's doable too. Just, you know, takes sometimes a patient builder to listen to all those and answer all the emails. But the more planning you do up front, I would say, is the best thing you can do. Just it kind of eliminates all those log jams later when you're waiting for a decision about the species of wood for your windowsills or something else. Yeah.
So what does a general contractor do, and why should I not do it myself? On any project of size, the general contractor is going to manage the overall progress of it. While they do a lot of the actual, as Pete mentioned, the carpentry and the siding and interior trim at various construction phases, they also have a network of subcontractors they use who will do often foundation, electrical, plumbing, you know, maybe your low voltage wiring, painters, drywall, it's a whole teamwork approach. And a lot of us have subcontractors we've worked with for years and an existing relationship, which means that we also get a response from them that you as a homeowner probably won't. There's a lot of subs that simply won't work directly for a homeowner because it's just more complicated. They don't want to manage that. So you get a smoother project that goes much faster if you involve a general contractor rather than you trying to be that person, because there's a lot of moving pieces involved in it. We have existing relationships with a lot of the code officials and inspectors that, you know, kind of help that process as well. You can do it yourself. It'll take longer. It probably won't cost you much less.
Things to consider when hiring a contractor. I would, yeah, I would interview a few folks. Like, I don't think Off or I really advertise at all. It's sort of just word of mouth, and honestly, speaking for myself, that's how I've always preferred it. I'd rather have, you know, a friend of a friend refer me and say nice things about me. And then kind of all the pre-screening done is done. I don't get total crazy people that are just looking to, you know, get a magical price on something. They, you know, they're usually very realistic people that approach me because my friends have already sort of screened them out. And so I would, yeah, I would ask your friends that have built something before you. I would, you know, find someone that's had a bunch of good experiences with a contractor. I'd try to see a house or two that they built, and you can sort of, a quick eyeball test often does a lot. You can kind of just see if they're paying attention to details. And I think that's the best way. If you don't know anyone that knows contractors, yeah, I would just really diligently interview them and ask for some references and, you know, follow up on that. The problem right now, honestly, is everyone is booked that I know for years. So it's going to be hard to find a warm body that will show up with a hammer at this point. But the sooner you get them signed up, the better, because it's just right now there's a bit of a construction crush going on with everyone being trapped in their house for a year and wanting to fix everything. Off, is this you? Are you doing the challenges?
Oh, I think building small is you and your freestanding.
Okay. Yeah, the
lines coming up with that.
yeah. So just because an ADU is going to be smaller than a house, it's not proportional cost wise. In the previous ADU workshop, Jason from Artisan's group had a picture of a gigantic dog with a tiny dog sitting on top of it, and it was adorable. And it was also like, oh yeah, that doesn't cost exactly, you know, 1/10 to house a tiny dog compared to a large dog. And I got it. Good job, Jason. And it's similar since we're building all the expensive rooms in a small house. You know, you're going to need a kitchen, you're going to need bathrooms. A larger house will have lots of big empty rooms with nothing fancy in them, and the cost of those is cheaper than, you know, installing the infrastructure of plumbing and all that. So yeah, if you break it down to square foot pricing, a small house is going to cost more per square foot than a large house. So just be aware of that. It's just a fact of life. So this is a little, I mean, technically in my mind, it's an ADU. We actually demoed a small garage and permitted this as a garage, but we built it to comply with all the ADU rules. And we even put plumbing in for a future kitchen. So if the client wanted to convert it into an ADU, it would be really easy, and all the design parameters were already adhered to. And yeah, it's just one of Artisans Group's first really great little smart designs. I think it's like 799 square feet. So they maximize the 800 square foot limit. It was permitted right in that weird phase where Olympia adopted ADUs, but then retracted them. So we were glad that we permitted this as a non-ADU, because maybe that would have affected things. But yeah, Virginia, will you go up one slide? Oh, I thought there was more photos of that one. Oh yeah. Yeah, so I mean, it was a tight, tiny little site. And the interesting part for me was actually just staging the construction. We just had that little grass plot in front, you know, to store all our materials. And it was surprising how a small site is difficult to build on, just because if you imagine the excavation for the foundation, that hole gets bigger. You have gigantic piles of dirt that you're trying to work around. And there was just nowhere to, we didn't have much parking on the road. So it was for the builder, it was really interestingly challenging. The next slide, please. I wanted to show this on a tiny Olympia site. You're going to have to manage the drainage from the gutters and the perimeter drainage, and you're not going to know that the city's going to require what they call a little dry well. So here in this trench, all the pipes from the downspouts are going to come into, so the water can kind of fill this area and drain into the soil over time. Without it, you would just have a huge amount of water just spitting out into a tiny yard, and it would, overflow into the neighbor's yard. And the general best practice is to keep all your water on site. So there's you're going to need little extra spaces for things like this, and it's going to impact your yard. This took out a couple nice garden beds. We were able to put the garden beds back on later, but it's not just the footprint. There's going to be a few more site issues you're going to have to think about. And this goes back to having a good plan from the start. This was in the Artisans Group site plan from the beginning, and it's just super helpful, kind of knowing all the check boxes that the city's going to want. Having an experienced person that knows those from the beginning is super helpful and cuts down on all your future problems.
Great, Pete, thank you so much.
Yeah.
We've got a bunch of questions rolling in now. So as we move on to discussion of conversions, I just want to encourage everybody to send in their questions. We're running a couple of minutes behind now. So yeah, thank you so much, Pete. Let's move on to the conversion phase of our presentation.
Okay, so tales from basement remodels. I've done a number of them. Only one of them has actually been ADU-ish with the kitchen, but the problems are all the same. So headroom is often a first thing. The ceiling height may not be 8 feet, it might be shorter. There may be beams underneath. You can move the slide. And so sometimes you're inserting new beams. This is just an example of a large beam. Here we're on a ground floor, so it easily comes in through a window. But trying to get something like that into a basement can often be challenging. Next slide. Once you get it in, you have to move it up. Here, this beam is going to support some other cross beams, so it's larger, but we're in the process of using a jack to move it up into a slot that we've carefully prepared. We've put in temporary supports to support other things while we get this in place and make attachments. Next slide. The existing heating is often below your floor joists in your basement, and it provides issues. You have to build down around them. You either remove it, but that's got to go somewhere. As you see on the right side of that oddly shaped duct, there's a sign, "How is this room heated?" So we had to invent that. We wound up putting a new duct in there and closing off another one that went to the upstairs to keep the volume the same. Sometimes the existing furnace doesn't put out enough heat to also heat the basement, and you have to do other things. There are an array of options ranging from lavish and expensive to pretty affordable. Next slide. And you find hidden things. We had no idea. This is a supply line inside of a return line. So the flat steel there is between the joists, and that sucks air back to the furnace, but the round one pumps hot air out to some place that it was going. In this case, also, the joint was held together with a gray kind of matte colored tape. When you see that, you have asbestos. It's a really common thing to find. We test for it all the time, but sometimes you find surprises. Next one. Plumbing, you've got to deal with plumbing. This was a basement project I took over from a job where the client, the contractor, basically his business failed and he walked away in the middle of it. So what you see in the lower right corner is a pump. And so the water from the bathtub on the left, which is built up on a platform to create slope, the laundry sink above it, and the washer and dryer to the right, all flow to that little pump that then pumps it up the hill to the existing first floor plumbing. Generally, I recommend against these because pumps always fail and then you've got a mess. In this house, over to the side of the tub, there was a toilet. So there was a ground level drain that left. I'd have dug up the concrete and put all of the drains down underneath. It would be much more secure. Budget wise, we had to work with what we had here. So that's a consideration. Next. And there's existing drains and stuff that come down. We're looking straight up at part of the existing plumbing system and added on plumbing from the house. And you have to build chases down around, which change the shape of the ceiling and require a surprising amount of time. Next. And here's a plumbing drain that came up. In this case, the basement had a section for a bathroom that had a built-up floor. And so this came up through the basement slab. It was not in the right place. So we had to remove the floor, jackhammer out the concrete, relocate the drain line. And it's a common basement or, for that matter, garage consideration. Do the next one. There's a matter of windows, which are both for light and for egress, for emergency purposes. And there are minimum codes about how wide the opening has to be, how tall it has to be, and how much total area is. And it's actually based on enough space so a firefighter with a backpack can climb through that window for rescue purposes. So often we dig a big hole. You'll notice also here that the existing landscaping is severely impacted, and you have to have a cooperative neighbor because that's another house next door and we're on their property. Next. So you dig a hole down and then you have to cut the concrete. We bring in a specialist with saws and they do stuff to help control the water because it's a wet saw, but you have to cut a larger hole. Next slide. And then you build a well around it because of course you're below grade. There's a larger window that meant egress. We added a couple of them for people who wanted to turn the basement into some bedrooms. The next slide. And here's the net result, right? You have a larger window, it lets in more light, the level is down low enough you can crawl out. In this case, that retaining wall is short enough you don't have to have a ladder to climb out of it. That happens. And in the end, you're still in a basement. You've got a view of the retaining wall. It's better, but it's not like being above grade, which just means that there's always compromises when you do a basement remodel. Also in the upper corner, you see where the ductwork was framed around and sheetrocked. It creates a funny ceiling line, a lowered area. Again, compromises you make when doing a basement remodel. Mm-hmm. That's it.
So what about costs there, Off? Is it always cheaper to convert than to build new? What's your take?
Usually, because you get to work within the existing footprint of the building. You still have everything involved in a new construction. You frequently have to build walls and insulate and deal with vapor barriers, worry about what's up with insulation in the floor, all of these modifications. It's usually cheaper than building a new building, but it's not to say that it's cheap.
I would agree. Yes.
Yeah.
What's your take on that, Pete?
I'll just a different perspective is that, I mean, you're in my mind as someone that builds mostly new things. I try not to do any renovations anymore. Just it feels almost like a different skill at this point. So for me, considering renovations, I just feel terrible about all the time you need to spend demoing and what feels like to me going backwards to get to the point where you can start building new again. And for me, I'd rather put all my money into something going forward that is I know is going to be hold up over time better. But sometimes it's not a choice. I mean, sometimes the basement apartment is the thing that makes the most sense. So you just hire an expert like off and go forth. Yeah.
Yeah, they are different games.
Yeah. I think maybe just my patience level isn't that great for going backwards and, soffitting around little pipes like off a showing. I was just like, God, I haven't done that in 15 years. Thank God. You're doing God's work off.
No, thank you.
Yeah.
Who wants to dive into the prefab question here?
I'll take the prefab. When we're talking prefab, it could be a tiny house on a trailer frame. It could be a park model mobile home. It could be a manufactured home. And different jurisdictions are going to have very different rules about this. So it's entirely dependent on where you are. City of Olympia has a different rule than Thurston County. And Thurston County, it's different if you're in some jurisdictions, urban growth area, as compared to out in the county in general. Cities generally don't like mobile units installed. It doesn't fit the housing profile that they're looking for. So really what you need to know is what the requirements are in the place you live. And it's even a manufactured home usually is going to involve all of the upfront costs that were in Pete's in terms of getting all the utilities, the electric, the plumbing, the sewer, often building a foundation, dealing with drainage issues. All of that happens aside from having the building placed on there. And that building placement is usually done by somebody that specializes in that work, not somebody like me or Pete.
Good. So again, talk to your municipality before you start thinking about this. Well, in the last few minutes of this presentation, we've asked Pete and Off to sort of just converse about a couple of topics that people ask us about. So while they're doing that, we've still got time for people to submit questions. So go ahead and write your questions if you have them. And yeah, let's go.
I don't understand the question.
Yeah.
No. It just takes a long time. It's involved and it's sequential, and there's various people that have to do some work before somebody else can get in, and you're juggling a lot of schedules. It's not like television. Yeah,
for me, it's besides just it takes a long time to build a damn house. The getting the subs on time, all the time is tricky, especially now that if I didn't have the relationship I have with my plumber and be able to get them, on 5 weeks notice, like they're booked out 3 solid months. So I have to, put a schedule together and lock everyone's times in way ahead of time. And then they actually show up at that time, which is almost like a magic trick right now. Like if you're a homeowner, it's going to be really hard to get a subcontractor to show up when you want them to. So that might be our greatest power, is having some subs that will show up on a reasonable time frame. I've never had a disaster. I don't know anything about them.
Yeah. It depends, there's a disaster like your first floor collapses because the underneath isn't adequately supported. That's a disaster. For most homeowners, it's that we found something horrible and it's going to cost more money, either asbestos or something that needs remediation, rot that was hidden behind something totally inadequate that changes the scope of work, so it becomes more expensive. Some of it you avoid by being thorough ahead of time, testing things, getting out a level. Is that basement slab 2 inches higher in the middle than it is at the wall? So some of it's foresight and experience comes from missing things and bad decisions. So just worry about it.
Yeah, I would, on that real quick, since I build more new things than renovations, I think I have less surprises. Early in my career on really tight budgets, I wouldn't do like soil tests as often as I do now. And that was my biggest weak spot was, it was time to excavate, and it was just all clay for 6 feet down. And, we'd have to add in a bunch of rock, which cost a bunch of money. And then more currently, lumber prices have almost tripled over the last few months. So the house I'm building now, it's a fixed price contract, and lumber tripled in price. And, I'm kind of wrestling with how to pay for that. So those are my big two, is wild price swings and surprise soils. Yeah, not much. I'll go first off. That little ADU thing that we showed, we just finished that about a year ago. My total receipts were about 175,000, and I'm pretty sure the client probably paid another 20,000 for the design, permitting, and, well, I guess that includes the garage demo, because I did that. So the square foot price came out about $218 per square foot for an 800 square foot building. I would say today it would easily be about $240 a square foot with the lumber prices. But yeah, we did that it was probably about 185,000 start to finish. So yeah, I guess the easy way to compute that is figure out what that loan would cost, and if you're going to rent, does that cover the mortgage and insurance, and is that a viable way to proceed? Or do whatever you want. That's your business. I don't care. Cost 185,000 or something like that.
Mhm. And I usually find that shooting from the hip, I hit myself in the foot. So I really need to sit down and kind of do some pretty rough calculations on what's in it, because everything I do can be completely different from something else. So a bathroom remodel is wildly different from one thing to another. Generally, it's going to be more than you imagined it would. Sticker shock is a real thing, and I try and get a realistic budget early on in the conversation before I provide a detailed quote with full specifications, because we need to know if you can afford this. Be really tough to get away with something at $100 a square foot these days, I think.
Impossible.
Goes up from there as a remodel. I used to think you could do something for 85, and I don't think that anymore. And it goes up from there. So
yeah. Other things we wish people knew before starting a project. I feel like we covered the big ones. I'm drawing a blank off. Anything?
My note says, I wish people understood that there is no such thing as a free quote. Quotes take a lot of time and experience and knowledge. What it means is, and usually it's the owner's work, labor doing that, your highest paid person in the company. And so somebody pays for that time. Usually it's the people who hire the contractor, because it's part of overhead. Try not to waste people's times getting like 9 quotes because you want the cheapest thing. If you need the cheapest project possible, which is a valid concern, I mean, budgets are real. You need to tell contractors that up ahead of time so that somebody knows what they're aiming for and whether that's actually their business model they could meet. So that's what I wish people knew.
Yeah, that's a great point. Can you do this? Of course you can, hopefully. Yeah, you totally can. I mean, with the new regulations coming from Olympia and Lacey and Tumwater, it's highly doable. Environmentally, I think urban density is one of the best things you can do. Move everyone closer to the facilities and services, and you have less driving and more walking and biking and lesser, suburban sprawl. So the ADU thing, I think, is is going to be a really great thing for Olympia. Yeah.
Yeah, I concur. More ADUs would be a great thing moving forward here. And
Yeah.
it can be done. That's it.
Yeah. Totally it. We're done.
Thank you so much. That
You
was
wish
really
you were
fun.
done. Virginia's got questions for you. The audience
Oh,
has
damn it.
questions for you.
Yeah.
And not surprisingly, a lot of them have to do with costs. I'm going to throw out the first one, which may, again, depend on where you're planning to build this project. But we have a question about whether it's less expensive to build a house with an ADU versus a duplex. Thinking about the impact fees, permit and sprinkler system requirements, and so on. Expense-wise, what's your take on that?
I'll go off. I mean, honestly, building a duplex is a much more efficient option. If you think about it, you're, instead of building two buildings with, you know, if they were rectangular with 4 walls, you're building one gigantic rectangle, you know, that's a simple geometry thing. But yeah, as soon as you share a wall, you're saving a lot of materials, you're using less energy, the footprint is smaller. You're kind of combining all the infrastructure. You just have one sewer going in, going out, and one water line coming in, same with power. So I would say a duplex is going to be a much more cost-effective way to house more people than building 2 structures. Olympia, you know, the core of Olympia is already set up with a lot of, you know, single homes with yards. So in that regard, if the house is really shabby and is kind of done with its lifespan, I would consider the duplex option instead of, you know, building an ADU. The site very well might be more conducive to housing 2 families, you know, than 1 family and 1 dude out back. So that is a real consideration that I would.
And with a duplex, you're not constrained by the 800 square foot rule. You can 2 houses with equal square footage that's over 800, but still, you know, compact. So you've got more design leeway.
Yeah. On that point too, I go to lots of like building conventions with my energy efficiency stuff, and you know, their main goal is the environmental angle, and you know, their goal is to house as many people smartly near an urban core as possible. I noticed a lot of my friends are always like, ew, another box with like too many people in it. But I mean, Olympia, I mean, my friends that are looking for places to rent right now, the costs have just gotten insane just from supply and demand. And I think you might want to get used to the idea of, you know, more people being housed closer to downtown. And that's going to require some boxier buildings with more people in them. And that, I mean, that's going to be the main way that gets rental costs and buying costs down. There's just no houses for sale right now, from what I hear, and that's driving the cost astronomically high, and rent prices are just bananas right now. So yeah, Olympia might not always be like cute little houses that can barely fit 3 people in them. You know, it might have to change to adapt. A lot of people are going to be moving here just based on climate data. It's a no-brainer. The Pacific Northwest is one of the best places to live.
It's such an important point to keep in mind. Yeah, think of the larger community and the kind of impact that you can have through your construction choices. Yeah. Well, the next question is sounds a little specific. It's about delivering materials to a building site. In particular, this question asks if a 30-foot long and 4-foot wide access to a building is adequate. That may be too much for you to go into, but in terms of size constraints on a parcel, what have you encountered with delivering building materials to a site? And there's a particular question about cement trucks. How do you get around those kinds of issues?
Um, cement is surprisingly easy. There's gigantic boom trucks that can boom right over an existing house and put concrete in a backyard. There's also line pumps, like concrete can be pumped really far. So if you can get a hose, within, I don't know what the maximum is, at least I've seen 100-foot line pumps. So concrete is remarkable how quickly you can get into a faraway space. Lumber delivery, you can get lumber delivered on these really cool forklifts that can drive sideways, so they can fork off the long lumber, but then the fork turns sideways and the whole thing can scoot up probably a 10 or 11-foot wide space if it's solid ground. All that's manageable. I mean, often I build in Olympia, and there's always some kind of room. People in larger cities are building with no yards at all, and there's ways to manage.
And the question was specifically about a 4-foot wide by 30-foot long. So you hand carry all of your lumber through it.
Yeah.
As Pete mentioned, concrete is easy, but you can't get an excavator back there, so all of your digging is by hand.
Yeah.
Which
Sounds hard.
harder and slower and more expensive, and
Yeah.
nobody wants to do it.
Yeah, and maybe that's an example of, like, you don't get a basement, you get a slab, or
Right.
Yeah.
I had a question about soil tests. You touched on that, Pete. What's the purpose of doing a soil test?
A lot of the time you can just dig down and you can tell the soil's going to be fine. I always drive a few stakes in different spots just to see, how the soil resists, how much. It's kind of a long story, but if your yard is really clayey, that's often a sign that you're going to need to do a lot of soil amendment. You'll probably need to scoop out a bunch of clay and put in a bunch of rock. If you have sort of, what you'd call normal soil with lots of aggregate in it, it's probably fine. Yeah, it's kind of a deeper question. I wouldn't worry about it unless you just live in a clay pit.
Any
Which
thoughts
is
on
lay
that?
out a lot of the points.
Yeah, and if you're one of these muck people, then that's maybe not your biggest problem. Getting out of this muck world is, anyways.
Out of the muck world.
Yeah.
We had another question about the material constraints and rising costs and how they're affecting your time frame. I think you touched on that. Do you have anything to add to the thought about time and material, or the material costs rather, and how they're affecting your work?
This is a never
Not gonna go
before
down in
seen. Yeah, this is like a hopefully once in a lifetime spike. It's insane. Like OSB plywood is $48 at Home Depot yesterday. It's always like $15, $16. If it gets to 20, you're like ready to start a riot in the Home Depot, and just so it's, instead of $15, it's 3 times the price right now. And that's in, across all the basic lumber, that's the number. So it's right now it's 3 times, which has never been seen before by a lot. So this is a COVID related spike and ties to the wildfires too. So it has to come back to normal, or somewhat normal. So I wouldn't worry about it right now, because you're not going to find anyone to build anything within the next year anyways. So it should be back to normal by then.
And you might encounter a clause in a contract that says material prices may be repriced at time of delivery, because you're asking somebody to roll the dice and make a bet as to what the materials are going to cost. And it's something that's frankly out of the builder's control. So there may be, allotments made for that kind of an adjustment.
And that's a recent phenomenon because of these rising costs, or is that?
Yeah, I mean, prices always go up, but the stuff in the last 6 months, 9 months has just been nuts. A spike from something like a hurricane or something will cause a ripple through the national supply chain. But this impact has just really changed things. Like electricians can't find boxes to build up to put the electricity in your house. Just the simple plastic nail-up box. You can go to Home Depot, the shelves are empty. And so are the wholesale warehouses. So, it's an extraordinary time, so you might temporarily see these. Ordinarily, I wouldn't put that in. You know, I've got enough leeway in my quote to accommodate minor price changes.
That sounds crazy. We've got a question about design here that might be good for you, Pete. When you're designing a detached ADU, this questioner asked, what is the most important design consideration? There's probably more than one. What should people be thinking about design-wise when they're contemplating building a detached ADU versus a house, for example?
Yeah, I would definitely watch the previous video from you guys on planning. Jason walks through how they, walks through this whole process really beautifully. And where he placed his ADU was really smart because, if you think of 2 boxes, he wound up dealing with all the setbacks, everything, and then tweaking it so it was each house was in each other's blind spot. So I think I would say sighting is the main thing. Like, don't have 2 boxes staring into each other at the dining, so their dining room tables are looking right at each other. You just by simple smart placement, you can keep everything really private, and it makes the whole property feel bigger for both properties. And I'll go with sighting it correctly.
Yes, I think Jason did address that, not just siting with respect to the existing structure, but also taking into consideration the grade on your site. You may have a slope that would make a large part of your property unbuildable, basically. So you have to think about the relationship to the contours of the site as well as the existing structure. That's really good.
Also, he cited it so they both shared the driveway really smartly, so it didn't need a separate driveway, and smart considerations like that. It's where a really experienced designer comes in super handy.
Well, on a design-related point, have there been times when you have advised a client will come directly to you? Have you ever advised somebody to go back and hire an architect to work out some of the issues?
Yeah, for me, the more I work with really smart architects that have really great planning people on their staff, like Jason, it's hard to go back because, I early in my career, I'd have to do all the permitting, and I build one house every 9 months. 9 months go by and I've forgotten all the setbacks, and so yeah, dealing with someone that knows all these check boxes that need to get checked for the county or the city is so hugely helpful. And ultimately, I like, they're not cheap, but it's money so well spent and makes the builder's life so much easier, and which makes the client's life easier because I have so many less surprises when the upfront planning is done well.
Any other thoughts?
Sure.
Yeah. Question about energy efficient materials.
Yeah.
How do you incorporate energy efficient or greener materials into construction? How challenging is it to use some of the newer materials that are being developed?
I'll keep going first off so you know when to come in. Yeah, that's my whole shtick is like, using the greenest materials I can for the best energy efficient shell. It's what keeps me really interested in building. And you don't have to use a lot of newfangled stuff. You just want to be really coherent of all the principles of what makes a good working house in this climate. And the budgets in Olympia aren't wild. There's never tons of extra money in a house project, at least on my projects. And so, over 20 some years, I've just figured out the best cost-effective way to make a super insulated shell from local smart materials. I try to stress non-toxic stuff, locally sourced, and durable. So I'll make compromises sometimes, like I'll use rigid foam, which is less environmental than rock wool, but it's affordable and it works great. And I'll use the EPS foam because it has the lowest global warming potential. And,
Mhm.
so yeah, I think that answers the question sort of. Oh,
Yeah.
and great windows, super great windows,
Mhm.
makes a huge difference.
And I'd add that it's partly a function of continuing education. You go to conferences, I do that too. I'm constantly reading stuff and looking at what's coming down the pipe from building science professionals. And so not just doing things the way I've always done it, but always looking for something that's going to be a little better, a little more efficient. Sometimes it's a little faster. So there's a matter of being interested in moving forward all the time.
Yeah,
So
there's also besides using less energy, the houses are more comfortable, which
yes.
is an important point. People like them more, and if you're doing it right, it should be vastly more durable because you're dealing with any air leaks that'll cause moisture problems in the future, which will cause rot and mold. So if your builder's doing blower door tests and external insulation, they're probably on the ball and pretty fastidious.
And I just want to take a second to tout the resource page on the OPOP website. There's a link there to the Northwest Eco Building Guild. If you want to educate yourself about the innovations that are happening in green building, it's an excellent place to start. I'm not talking about you guys, I'm talking about people who want to build an ADU. So there's a lot of good information there that could help you answer these questions. We've got two more questions in just a few more minutes. So here's a really specific one for you. Can you speak to the advantages and disadvantages of slab on grade versus perimeter footing foundations?
Yeah, I do both. If it's a slab on grade, I do kind of a very, very insulated slab on grade. It's a fine way to go. Pretty cost effective. Perimeter foundation is going to be cheaper up front. The only problem with they work great. A ventilated crawl space type foundation works great in our climate. There's a really good study by WSU about it, and in this climate, it's a great way to go. The only problem with it is that it makes a crawl space, and someday you're gonna have to go into that crawl space and chase out a possum or, find some ungodly rodent or dusty spider situation. So the slab on grade, if it's done well, eliminates that whole thing from your life. There's less chance your pipes will ever freeze, which will eliminate the need to go into a crawl space. The problem is there's less flexibility. If you want to change your plumbing in the future with a slab on grade, you need to tear up concrete and flooring, and whereas the crawl space you can adapt really easily from below. So they're both decent ways to go. I would do the slab on grade, I think, in an ADU, where it's not big enough to do many changes in the future. I think that's a really smart way to go. I'll often put my pipes in conduit, so if I ever needed to repair them, I could just pull them out and replace them. That's too much information. They're both good.
Yeah, there's a lot of nasty crawl spaces out there. That's a little more my department than Pete's. And I could tell horror stories, but I'm not gonna.
Yeah.
But my own is well lit and has lots of headroom based on my experience elsewhere.
Yeah.
Well, just to get the image of the rodents in the crawl space out of everybody's minds, let's end on a positive note. Can you describe one or two happy surprises or projects that you've really enjoyed to encourage people and kind of get them thinking in a positive manner?
So not possums.
Not possums.
Possums are really important animals to the ecosystem. Great surprises. God, I can't think of one off the top of my head, just because my projects run so smoothly with no problems ever.
I get feedback from clients often years later that the work we've done has totally changed the way they live in their house.
Yes.
And makes everything more satisfactory. The kids get along better. whatever they
one.
can accommodate guests better. Outdoor living becomes more feasible. They have better access. The light has really changed. You know, I hear back from people a lot about the positive changes that they have experienced in the way they live. And often I'll tell people ahead of time, you know, we get to the end of the job, you're going to be really happy to have it over and probably be glad to have us gone. But we'll talk again in 6 months. You'll feel a little different.
I thought of one, and that's I keep the newest house that I built for me and my family. We built basically an ADU connected to it. It's technically one house, but it's pretty obviously an ADU connected to a main house, and that was for my in-laws. And a lot of my clients are the next house I'm building. The mother-in-law is moving in as well to the main house, and living with your parents or in-laws can be really, really cool. And it's been really great for my kids and super great for my in-laws. And yeah, that's a great example of like the ADU idea working really well with the multi-generational aspect.
Right, that combination of separation and connection,
Yeah.
so that you each have your own private spaces, but
Yeah.
not all.
Yeah, and I'd encourage you to maybe think about building your ADUs sort of ADA compliant, which means, you know, if someone's in a wheelchair, they'll have easy mobility and easy access to everything, because so many folks are having their parents move in with them, and it's probably a smart, simple thing to do from the beginning.
Thank you both. Wow, this is a lot. It's been awesome to hear you. I feel like my brain is on fire in a kind of different way than it was during the planning and design session. And I'm thinking about off and the 6 months later when someone loops back after the dust has settled literally in their construction project, and how much enjoyment they get out of the extra space as I sit in my basement. Not an ADU, but in my lovely basement. Thank you for sharing your expertise with us today. Also, to everybody in the audience, keep an eye out on the OPOP website for this video to be posted. As I mentioned, it'll probably be within a week. And then share it with your friends along with all of the other ADU resources that we've pulled together. You can also sign up on the OPOP website to be on the OPOP email list. I'm pretty judicious about how I use that. I try not to spam people with things, only send stuff when it really seems relevant for either advocacy or events. And thank you so much for spending your Saturday morning with us. I hope everyone has a wonderful afternoon and gets outside, because it's really looks like it's a gorgeous day. So take care, and thank you all for being here today.
Yeah, so long. Thanks.
Yeah. Thanks, Janae. Thanks, Virginia. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.